Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. How do you protect human rights in a conflict zone? That's been the preoccupation of our next two guests for much of the past 2 decades. Both have worked at Human Rights Watch, possibly the world's most respected international human rights non-governmental body. There's Stacy Sullivan, currently Director of Communications with HRW. Hello, Stacy. Where are you talking to us from? Stacey's going to need your microphone on because I think you're muted because you've got children there in the background, but go ahead, Stacy.
I'm on Long Island in New York right now.
Oh, lucky you. The weather's probably better there than it is here at the moment. And then we've also got Peter Boucjkaert, who's formerly the Emergencies Director from HRW as well. Hello, Peter.
Hello, and I'm joining you from France.
Whereabouts in France are you, Peter? I can see vines and sort of nice weather as well.
Yes, it's Burgundy. Luckily.
Burgundy, very nice, very nice. Well, it's going to be a great discussion. I think many of you know about HRW, but I don't really think you know how they work. So I want to get some explanation of how that organization works, but also how human rights workers work. And also want to probe a little. What gives them the right to do this work? What is the legal basis for it? And who benefits? I should also add that and disclose that I worked briefly for HRW back in 2008 and covered the West Bank and Gaza during that time, but I hope it won't prevent me from asking some tough questions. So let's start with you, Peter. You're in a conflict zone or a war zone. What are your objectives and how do you actually do your job? Peter.
Yes, the human rights movement didn't really start by working on conflict zones. It really came more out of the former Soviet Union and an interest in protecting freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and political freedoms in repressive societies. And it's only really in the 1990s with the Balkan Wars and the conflict in Rwanda that the human rights movement started thinking about how to document war crimes and crimes against humanity in a systematic way. And obviously documenting political freedoms in Eastern Europe meant working under surveillance, meeting with dissidents and others in secret. Going into a conflict zone is a very different kind of work, requiring different skills. First of all, we have to be on the ground. We go into these conflicts when everybody else is fleeing. And then we have to have access to the witnesses who've seen these incidents and the evidence on the ground to document exactly what's happening. Because our objective is to get to the bottom of these things, to really establish the truth. Let me give you an example. I covered the war in Lebanon in 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah. When the war started, I flew into Jordan and we had to cross all the way through Syria after negotiating and giving a little present to the border guards to get into Syria. And then we had to drive into Beirut while Israeli airplanes were flying overhead, trucks were burning, targets were being attacked. And then we started investigating who exactly was dying in these airstrikes. Israel was saying that they were attacking Hezbollah rocket storage spaces. And so we went to all of these villages and we interviewed the people who had been around Israeli airstrikes. And what we discovered is that Israel actually was working on a mistaken assumption. They had assumed that Hezbollah had placed most of their rocket storage facilities inside these towns, and they were bombing targets inside the towns, when in fact, the rocket storage facilities and launching sites were outside the villages, hidden in the olive groves and other rural infrastructure. And you know, you can say, how do you know if people are actually telling you the truth? We went through dozens and dozens of graveyards to actually see how people were buried. Because if somebody belongs to Hezbollah and is a fighter, they will be buried as a martyr. They will not be buried as a civilian. So we went to document over 1,000 deaths in Lebanon, and we were able to establish, and we took that evidence back to Washington and to Tel Aviv, that they were hitting the wrong targets.
Okay, so that's, I mean, it's a tremendously sort of courageous job, and in a way, it sounds like reporting in a way like a journalist. But I think the difference here, and what one has to understand is, what standard are you holding the military up against? I mean, on what basis are you saying they're doing something wrong? Okay, so they've killed some civilians, but who says that's wrong, and how can you hold that government to account, or that army to account?
You know, I think it's very important to distinguish our work from the work of journalists. Journalists report stories. They quote people saying things and denying things. We are investigators. We're actually investigating what happened in these situations and collecting evidence, because on the basis of the evidence that we collect, people can be indicted. Countries can decide to go to war to stop genocide or other crimes against humanity. So a lot of responsibility weighs on our shoulders. We are actually checking if people are telling us the truth. We're interviewing multiple witnesses to various incidents.
So it's international humanitarian law, and that's basically a development from both the Hague and the Geneva Conventions. So those laws have been developed more recently, and that when you're looking at particular incidents, you're actually holding that as a standard to see whether they've actually broken those laws.
Absolutely. I'm a Stanford trained lawyer, and I investigate these issues as legal issues, as crimes. We're investigating international crimes. And before we're going to accuse anybody of a crime, we want to make sure we have our facts right. We also use technology, satellite imagery. I use satellite imagery in Lebanon and in the Central African Republic to monitor the extent of the damage. We documented over 100 villages burned in the Central African Republic during the war. We also we monitor the social media accounts of various rebel groups in Syria to see what kind of weapons they're using. They often proudly display the war crimes that they commit. And then we have to verify those videos, establish exactly where they were recorded. You know, it is possible to get to the truth. It takes a lot of investigative work, but that's what we're after, is getting to the bottom of the matter.
Thanks, Peter. I think that was a great introduction there. Let's come back to you now, Stacy. So you're armed with this information, Stacy. What do you do with it?
I just wanted to back up for a second to say that in addition to what Peter mentioned, I remember in Lebanon in 2006, we also had a weapons expert on the ground. So he was someone that Human Rights Watch had hired from the Pentagon, and he could actually go and look at fragments of bombs that fell in Lebanon and see if they were smart bombs or dumb bombs, if they were laser guided, if they had any kind of GPS system on them. And that was just a kind of expertise that a human rights investigator brought that a journalist wouldn't necessarily have. So once we're armed, back to your question, once we're armed with the information, I mean, with something like that, we first of all try to brief journalists who are covering the conflict on the ground. And we're, you know, a lot of us are former journalists, so we have great contacts. It's a fairly small press corps that covers these kind of conflicts, so we know them well. I think we're pretty trusted by them. So we would first of all brief the media and try to get the story out in the immediate term in a conflict situation. And more long term, we would be cultivating contacts with the press to be able to tell them the larger story over time. And I would say that we would use the information both for advocacy, and in some cases, we've had some of our investigators, including, I think, Peter, you've probably testified, but some of them have testified at international war crimes tribunals and presented the evidence that we've collected.
Yeah. Okay. Can you give us some concrete examples? Some perhaps not about. I'll come to you, Peter, in a second to ask the same question. But Stacy, just give me some examples of where you think you've had, you know, significant impact.
Well, going all the way back to the 1990s, when I think, Nick, you were there too, when we were all covering the Balkans. Human Rights Watch issued really groundbreaking reports documenting ethnic cleansing and genocide on the ground. I mean, numerous reports. And our researchers then testified at the War Crimes Tribunal for Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader, and for several paramilitary leaders in Bosnia, and saw convictions actually as a result. So that's a pretty concrete example from us investigating, uncovering the crimes, publicizing them, testifying in a war crimes tribunal, and then getting some kind of accountability in the end.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that. Everyone, do start putting questions in the Q&A box. Both Peter and Stacy can answer a whole range of questions. Peter has covered a huge number of conflicts from Sri Lanka, I think Libya as well, a lot in the Middle East. So there's a huge number of things that he's got some first-hand experience of. Peter, I want to come back to you. First of all, I'd love to hear how what happened in 2006. So did the Israelis change what they were doing as a result, just as a concrete example? So I'll ask that question first, and then I want to come back to this question of law, and do you have the right to be doing what you're doing? So Peter, just talk about Lebanon to start with and how that changed things.
Well, just to add to what Stacy was saying, I mean, I think overall, looking back over the last 2 decades, even 3 decades, the biggest accomplishment of the human rights movement is that these issues are now framed in law. You know, that's the kind of discussion that takes place when these incidents exist. Nobody is really denying that there is a legal framework that should govern what happens in war zones. And those who do deny it often end up at the International Criminal Court. That is coming a little bit under challenge these days, I think, with the rise of all of these right-wing authoritarian leaders. But it has become a very mainstream issue to see conflicts in terms of legal obligations. In terms of Lebanon, yes, we did succeed to convince the Israelis that what they were doing wasn't working, not only directly through our evidence, but also through the pressure that came upon them from the US administration and from the Europeans saying, you need to stop this. And in the middle of the war, they basically switched tactics. They stopped the aerial bombing and switched to a ground offensive, which didn't go very far. And then ultimately they decided they could just not reach their objectives without causing massive civilian casualties and paying a heavy international price with the international community turning against them. You know, it's not easy to work in these very, very divisive conflicts where people have very strong opinions. They constantly accuse you of bias. But it is important to kind of cut through the fog of war and tell the story of what's really happening on the ground. And because we are so meticulous with our work, people listen to us. I mean, even the Israelis, I flew straight from Lebanon to Tel Aviv, and we had a meeting with the chief of staff of the IDF and just about the entire senior military leadership to present our findings. Obviously, they disagreed with some of them, but they took them very seriously.
So the criticism is this, and I think that is a good example, is that the laws of war, the basic premise was that this, the laws of war should be based upon military necessity. So an army or a country shouldn't go beyond what is military necessary, and in doing so harm the civilian population. But the shift has changed, and so that the focus is now on civilians, and that's taken the primacy away from armies and nation states. And so certainly, I think there have been many governments who've been critical of this shift. And so therefore, you could argue, for example, in Israel, they wouldn't have lost so many men on the ground if they'd been allowed to continue that strategy of air bombardment, Peter.
Look, we should remember that the framework of the laws of war came out of World War II. A conflict that caused millions of deaths, that led to a genocide against the Jewish people. My father was a refugee in that conflict. My grandfather was on the battlefield of Flanders as a medic treating the first victims of the world's first chemical weapons attacks. There is a reason why we have this framework in place and why it needs to be observed. And our role in ensuring that the framework of IHL, of international humanitarian law, is observed is fundamental in importance. Because the war crimes investigators from the International Criminal Court arrive only after we've done our work. They almost never enter an active conflict zone, and they rely on our information. I mean, we were together in Lubeton in Macedonia in 2001. I was witness number one against the Interior Minister of Macedonia for the massacre that we both witnessed there together. Our investigations are respected, and I don't think that the system promoting the laws of war could work without the roles of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the International Committee of the Red Cross, which does the same kind of investigations in a more confidential manner.
The massacre or the killings that Peter's referring to is in a village in northern Macedonia, which the Macedonian military forces, police forces, moved in and killed I think about 9 people in one afternoon, for which the Interior Minister was found not guilty after that trial. Stacy, the US has got a reputation for backing these standards, backing these investigations. So we can talk about the Balkans, for example, and the War Crimes Tribunal, yet it doesn't like to apply the same standards to itself. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. The US was in favor of, the US was one of the primary driving forces behind establishing the UN War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And likewise, the US was very much in favor of it for Rwanda. And depending on which administration is in charge of the country, it's had varying degrees of, or is in power in the country, it's had varying degrees of support for the International Criminal Court. But, right now we have an administration that is very hostile towards it, and we've never had, it's never been a very popular issue in the United States. The United States, like many countries, views itself as righteous and exceptional and doesn't want to abide by international treaties. So it's a difficult system. It's for the US, we're very supportive of it as long as it doesn't apply to us.
Yeah, so you can understand in a way while these standards are seen as lopsided standards. If you're a country in a developing world that's been accused of X, Y, and Z crimes, and you say, well, it's the US doesn't apply these same standards to itself, so why the hell should we be held to the same account?
A completely fair question, a completely fair argument. I don't think any of us who are involved in the human rights movement would ever attempt to rationalize the US position. And it's an unfortunate reality of, realpolitik in the world. Nonetheless, I think we have been able to make a difference in people's lives in upholding human rights, even in the United States and within international systems, even if our government is hypocritical in the application.
And I think it's important to stress that it may not be the system of international justice which is biased or lets the wealthy countries off the hook. The International Criminal Court has launched the investigation into the conduct of US troops in Afghanistan, which led to the State Department putting sanctions on the ICC officials. So, it's really the US, and from Western countries, only the US, which refuses to uphold international justice for its own soldiers, which refuses the scrutiny of the International Criminal Court.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think I've given you sort of quite a few questions about the legality of it. And please, everyone, if you're listening in and if you've got specific questions, yourselves, please do follow up on that. But now I just want to talk a bit about some, a couple of places, Peter, that you've covered. Can you give me an example of where it's been very, very difficult? You've got you think there have been clear cases of breaches of humanitarian law or the laws of war, but establishing that case has been very, very difficult. I just want to understand the difficulties in some situations of use of going about your work.
I think one of the most difficult moments for me was the genocide against the Rohingya people in Myanmar, Burma, just 3 years ago. Actually, 3 years ago yesterday, the conflict started. And we watched 600,000 people being burnt out of their home in just a couple of weeks. The establishment of one of the largest refugee camps in the world on mountains of mud. I interviewed woman after woman who had seen their husband shot in front of them, then their children clubbed to death in front of them, then were raped and beaten unconscious and put into burning homes. And we were left with a feeling of complete powerlessness because nobody really cared about these brown Muslims in Myanmar. Very few countries even wanted to speak out. And it was devastating.
So why, why is that? I mean, you said you used the word brown Muslims. I mean, what was necessary for things to change? Just run through what would be necessary for things to change on that front.
Well, look, I mean, I think there is a perceivable bias in the international system. The closer we get to Europe, the more concerned people are about human rights violations and violations of the laws of war. I mean, we talked about the village of Louboutin, a massacre of 14 people or whatever it was in Louboutin would have barely raised an eyebrow in most African countries or Asia. It would not even come into the news media. I mean, I documented massacres like that every day in the Central African Republic in 2014, 2015 for months, and nobody was paying attention until we forced the French to pay attention through a social media campaign. So it is unfortunately the reality that a lot of these decisions are made by Western powers about where we will intervene and where we will not intervene. And they have a much stronger emotional reaction when the victims are people that look like them.
Yeah. You've also worked with the migration crisis as well in Greece with, well, just actually go back a step just to clarify what was happening in the Central African Republic, who was killing who?
So the Central African Republic is one of the poorest countries in Africa. It's located in the center of Africa, as you can imagine by its name. It has long suffered from instability and corruption. In 2013, a Muslim rebel group from the extreme north, Muslims are a small minority in the country, overthrew the government with the help of the president of Chad. And they started a reign of terror in the country. These are the kind of images you see in African warlord movies about, sunglass wearing guys on pickups just firing into villages and burning them down. And that reign of terror unleashed a counter-reaction from the local population that basically led to the ethnic cleansing of Muslims from the country. A small group of Muslim rebels held the country hostage, but an entire Muslim population, mostly of rural cattle herders, paid the price for those atrocities.
Yeah. It sounds terrible when we were talking about such appalling events and then sort of glossing over one thing and going on to the next. But it's part of the necessity of talking about the breadth of what you were doing. So what were you doing I know you were in Greece, I know you're on the Greek islands and dealing with some of the refugees coming across. What was your concern there?
Well, just one point, like the reason why I'm talking to political tours today and why I've always supported your work, because it's really important to understand what is happening in these places. At the height of the conflict in the Central African Republic, we still had African trophy hunters coming into the country to shoot some rare antelope, completely ignorant of what was happening in the country. So I really support the work you're doing. And it is really important to have conscious tourism, to educate people about what's happening in these countries. The refugee crisis, you know, we always talk about the European refugee crisis, but actually the global refugee crisis is not in Europe. Only a very small percentage of displaced people and refugees end up in Europe. The real refugee crisis is in countries like Lebanon, where half of the population is either Palestinian or Syrian refugees, or Turkey, which is hosting millions of refugees from the Syrian conflict. And finally, at the end of the day, the valve just opened up. The pressure became too great. And with the involvement of criminal groups in Turkey and clearly the support of the Turkish government, because all of these people who got on the boats, they paid about 1,500 euros for their spot on the boat. We went to one small village in Turkey where 200 boats per night took off for Greece. You know, the people arrived by the bus loads, and you can imagine, you know, you need 200 crates of rubber Zodiacs with their motor assembled every night, just give you a scale of the operation. And, you know, Syrians and Afghans, Iranians, Iraqis started to arrive in very great numbers in Europe. It led to a massive crisis because Europe did not have a coordinated policy. Everybody started closing their borders. And as always, the refugee crisis ended up getting stuck in the poorest countries in Europe because that's where people arrive. As the wealthier Northern European countries turned their backs on the refugees and on their southern neighbors. So we still have a real crisis in Greece, in Italy in particular, where people are basically trapped. But the real place where people are trapped remains Turkey and Lebanon and the other countries where people are fleeing from a completely untenable situation in Syria. And in Afghanistan, you know, we're all concerned about the Syrians who now have seen 9 years of conflict. We should remember that Afghanistan has seen decades of conflict and just the same kind of brutality that many people face in Syria.
Yeah. I'm going to start taking questions now. So if we could bring up Nigel Harley. And there's a queue, an hours in a way is too short for the range of things that we can discuss here. But please do start putting your questions in the Q&A box to both Stacy and Peter. I'm gonna, while we're here and waiting for Nigel Harley to come up, because as each person asks their question, they have to be joined as an attendee. I want to mention Stacy Sullivan's book, which is an outstanding book, and I think actually one of the best books written about the conflict in Kosovo. And it's the story of a roofer, as it says there, in Brooklyn, who essentially helped arm the KLA. And it's not a book that takes sides, but it really gives you and it's an amazing story, and really, really well worth reading. So that's Stacy's previous life when she was a journalist, which led to this book, which is one of my favorite. Okay, Nigel Harley. I think Nigel, just there you go. Go ahead.
Yes.
Go on.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, I really wanted to know hear the views about the possibility of prosecuting Assad for war crimes in Syria, because you know the sheer scale of this is just incredible, and one would absolutely dearly love to see this man hauled in front of the court in The Hague. So I was just interested in your views on that.
Yeah, Stacy, can you just start by talking about, you've done a lot of work on Syria. So what have you tried to raise, and what impact do you think you've had, and what are the chances of Assad being prosecuted? You need to unplug your microphone
Yes,
too.
I should be unmuted now. To be honest, I'm not sure that I'm really equipped to answer that question.
Okay.
I do know that there has been at least one lawsuit on behalf of some Syrian refugees who were in Jordan. That was submitted to the ICC, but I don't know, maybe Peter, you could talk more about the mechanism on how it works and whether or not Syria is a party to the ICC and whether or not a prosecution can happen if a state is not a party. Because I think Peter's probably better equipped to answer that than I am.
Okay, yeah, go on, Peter, go on.
Yeah, I mean, so the situation in Syria is that Assad basically has, with Russian help, been able to regain control of much of the country, a country in ruins. The fact that he probably will likely survive in power makes it very difficult to get him detained and ultimately prosecuted. There is a mechanism underway, which is an investigative commission by the Human Rights Council, which documents the crimes being committed in Syria. It obviously faces a lot of resistance from the Russians. But I think Assad obviously will never travel to Europe again for a vacation. He does face very significant restrictions, and he is a persona non grata in much of the international world because of the crimes he's committed. I think the most interesting developments are the prosecutions which are taking place across Europe of people who were associated with his regime, who committed crimes, who tortured prisoners or executed people, and came as refugees incognito. They were recognized by their fellow refugees and referred for investigation, and they're now being prosecuted. I think that is a very important development, because it's not only holding the top level people accountable. You also want to hold the people below them accountable, so they think twice before implementing illegal orders, because Assad has everything to lose. And he's willing to do anything to remain in power. But it's his commanders who could face prosecution and who we want to have thinking about the consequences of their actions.
Got it. So let's bring in more questions now. So please do right away. I can see some people here with some legal minds here, and quite a few people who've traveled to some of the areas we've been talking about as well. Nigel, does that answer your question, Nigel? Nigel's microphone is still.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm
slow.
Yes, I think so. I mean, one just hopes to goodness that eventually this man will get his comeuppance. But yes, very interesting explanation, particularly about the refugees in Europe. Thank you.
Peter, can you just mention some of the recent reports that Human Rights Watch has done on Syria?
I actually left Human Rights Watch a few years ago, so Stacy might be better placed to do that.
And putting Stacy on the spot here, because Stacy has only recently left the ACLU. So
exactly. I only recently joined Human Rights Watch, rejoined Human Rights Watch 4 months ago. So I
mean, I can talk a little bit about it. We have investigated, when Human Rights Watch goes in, we investigate abuses by all sides. So we have investigated some of the major attacks on cities and large-scale massacres that have been committed by government troops, but also many abuses being committed by rebel groups. We have spent a lot of time documenting Russia's role in Syria, as well as Iran's role. Because, for example, Iran is forcing a lot of Afghan refugees living in Iran to go fight in Syria or be sent back to Afghanistan. I met many of these Afghans escaping from these practices when they were coming as refugees to Europe. And we always say, why are all these young men coming to Europe, young Muslim men? And that's one of the reasons, is because Afghans are being recruited by or forced by Iran to go fight in Syria. One of the other aspects we worked on a lot is the identification of weapons in Syria, because there are certain categories of weapons which are banned under international law or severely restricted, such as cluster bombs, which is a big bomb that splits into all kind of grenade-like little bombs and can cause a lot of civilian damage. They don't always explode, and kids pick them up. Landmines is another category under an international convention that bans their use. And then also chemical weapons. We were among the first to really establish that the Assad government was using chemical weapons against the civilian population. And when we issued our first report on the use of sarin gas by the Syrian government, I met with the French intelligence chief in Paris at the Quai d'Orsay, and he congratulated us. He said, "Your evidence is actually better than ours."
Well, nevertheless, you stand accused of bias. I mean, often by the governments you're investigating. I mean, can you just give us some examples of that and how you responded? Peter.
Sorry, you cut it out. You cut out in the middle of the question.
Frequently, there's the accusation of bias. When you're investigating a government, they will accuse you of bias. I mean, this is something you have to deal with quite frequently. Can you just give me some examples?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how little perspective any government or any rebel group has on the nature of our reports. They always only read the sections that relate to them. And they don't read the sections that relate to their adversary. So I thought at some stage we should just make a list of all of the biases that we've been accused of. You know, we've been accused of being anti-Israeli, anti-Hamas, anti-Palestinian, anti-Hezbollah, a Zionist agent, an excuser for terrorism, all of these kind of things. But when you actually read our reports, you'll see that we're only after the truth. We don't go after any government in particular, but we hold all of them to the same standard.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot here, and it's perhaps a little unfair. In 2008, I worked for Human Rights Watch in the West Bank and Gaza, and I undertook an investigation about an Israeli operation that led to the deaths of 22 Palestinians, and I documented those in a report that was 70,000 words long, too long perhaps. Unfortunately, that report never saw the light of day. Israel accuses Human Rights Watch of bias, but equally Human Rights Watch itself is accused of censoring what it does. Is that fair, Peter?
No, it was just a crappy report.
I gotta get a response from Stacy there too. Go on. Stacy, you're moving around, you're bouncing around there. What about that?
Apologies, I was interrupted by a couple of children, and then after I kicked them out, they didn't shut the door, so I had to get up and shut the door. I was going to come back to the question that you had asked me a little earlier about the other work that Human Rights Watch has done on Syria. And I can say that, so we've tried to actually do work on Syria that where we feel like we could actually have an impact. And with a conflict like Syria, it's very, very hard. So the last few reports we've done have been around, well, one of them was there are a whole bunch of children and women who had been married to ISIS fighters and have ended up in camps, and some of them are citizens of European or North American countries, and their governments won't take them back. So we recently did a report on the plight of Canadian kids, Canadian citizens who are stuck in ISIS, who are stuck in camps, and Canada won't repatriate them. That was something where we felt like, you know, we are well positioned with influential people in Canada. We have a Canada office. We went into the camps, documented who these kids were, what their situation was, how they ended up in these camps, and then pressured the Canadian government to repatriate them and take them back. With mixed success, but we did get a couple of the kids back. We also did a report on the plight of Syrian refugee children in Jordan who don't have access to education, and we were able to pressure both the Jordanian government and donors who fund refugee assistance in Jordan to provide education to allow access to allow these kids to go to school, also with some mixed success. Sometimes it's very frustrating because these seem like such small issues compared to the larger issue of people being systemically killed in Syria. But sometimes you have to work on reports where you actually can make a difference, and so that's been kind of our strategy. We also recently did a report on sexual violence against men and boys in Syria, and again with some mixed success of being able to provide some services for refugees in Turkey and Jordan. And it's just, you know, we would love to be able to do a report that would result in Assad going before the ICC and having an answer to these crimes. Unfortunately, sometimes we just have to live in this world and be realistic about where we can make a difference, and we work on smaller things, but that really can make a concrete difference in people's lives.
Yeah, okay. Let's bring in a few more people. Marcy Ryan, you've got a question. So Marcy, go ahead and there you go. Your microphone's free. You can talk.
I do, thank you. I'm in Connecticut, and Nicholas, you asked my big question about how can the United States work in this when we're so much guilty of committing these crimes. So that leads me to my question about how much credibility do American Human Rights Watch workers have in this work because of the United States position?
Peter, are you seen as Americans? Are you seen as, I mean, how do people view you when you're doing your work?
Well, I'm Belgian, and I try to emphasize that when I do this work, because
you're also a US citizen as well, aren't you?
Yeah, but I carry my Belgian passport these days, or in the last few years when I was doing this work. I mean, I do think there's a very significant impact on how Americans in general are perceived, and how the whole human rights field is perceived with the kind of extreme language coming out of Washington these days. It really does undermine not only our cause, but also our safety. And I think what we saw happen in Syria, not so much with human rights workers, but with journalists who were captured and executed by ISIS. Jim Foley, the last mission he went on before he was captured and ultimately executed, was with me in Libya. And I'm convinced that, you know, it was basically to give a black eye to America. So, you know, we used to have a certain immunity, protection as humanitarian workers, as human rights workers, even as journalists. And I think we see those protections being undermined worldwide, and not just because of America. I mean, we have a lot of journalists who are being detained or even killed in the Philippines as well under Duterte. We have the same situation in Russia. So the kind, you know, a press card used to serve as a pretty solid protection in most places around the world a few years ago. It just doesn't anymore.
So, and when you say press card, you're also talking about your ability to go and investigate things as well, having that sense of neutrality there, I guess.
Yeah, like a humanitarian jacket with a logo on it. People pretty much left you alone. I mean, I've met with the Taliban in Afghanistan and with rebel groups all over Africa, and nobody ever threatened me in that way. And I didn't have to worry too much about my safety, even when running into Hezbollah and groups like that, because they knew what we were there to do. There's many groups today, both militaries and rebel groups, where we can no longer assume that sense of safety.
If they knew you better back then, they'd have taken a different line on you, Peter, I'm sure. Andy Mendes, let's bring in you, please. Yeah, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Always hesitant to ask these sort of slightly controversial questions, Nicholas, but it keeps you going. I was interested listening to you again about your comments about Sarin and the Syrian conflict. And it's always puzzled me that if I were a resident in Syria, would I see a real difference between being gassed by illegal sarin or blown up by a legal bomb from one of the proxy institute or countries that are supporting it? And it does seem to me that in that example and in all examples that you talk about, we're really governed by international law, owned by and operated on behalf of the powerful nations. I'm just interested in your comments on that.
Go on, Peter, go on.
That's a very good question, and there's much what I agree with in what you said. You know, almost every conflict I went to, the journalists were always obsessed by very exotic weapons. They wanted to and cluster bombs and those kind of things. But as you said, the reality is that more conventional weapons like mortars and artillery and aerial bombs cause a lot of the destruction we see. So we have Human Rights Watch has a two-pronged strategy on this. The first is to seek to outlaw the most dangerous weapons, weapons which pose a significantly increased danger to civilians. For example, cluster bombs, because they have such a failure dud rate that a lot of kids end up picking them up and killing themselves. Chemical weapons, just because of their brutal history during World War II, and we've almost succeeded in universally outlawing them. And then with the legal weapons, we look at how they're used. We look at their indiscriminate use. We've done reports about airstrikes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, and how they've killed so many civilians. So we certainly don't just give the green light just because people are talking about legal weapons.
And the word that you use, or the word that is used when looking at these cases, is proportionality. How much was that force justified to target a legitimate military target? And what if there was a disproportionate impact on the civilian population around? And you do conventional armies, the IDF, the British Army, and the US theoretically do look at this each time they're targeting somewhere. That is meant to be a consideration.
Exactly. So let's say that Israel managed to locate Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. Then they would have to say who is in the same building. Are there 20 families living in the same apartment building who may also be killed if we hit this building? And is there a way that we can mitigate those casualties? For example, should we wait until Nasrallah goes for his daily walk around the block to hit him with a smaller, more precise weapon to decrease the civilian casualties? So those are the kind of calculations that have to take place. And that's also the model of analysis we use to, or Human Rights Watch uses to make judgment calls about these incidents.
Okay, now let's get some more questions in. So please do put questions in the box there. Stacy, what's been one of the sort of toughest things you've had to work on? You talked about picking up on cases where you can make a difference. And I mentioned the report that I wrote, and I think the discussion at the time was that it was too big a target, and I knew politically it wasn't going to be achievable. And I know that bits of the report were used later. So there is always this internal debate within organizations about what is going to be effective. But can you just give us some examples of where you've been particularly frustrated? You've talked about Syria. Are there other examples?
I mean, Israel is always a very difficult one because of the particular support of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. So, you know, if you criticize Israel, you are sure to be a target of a very well-organized group that defends whatever Israel does. And in the example of 2006, when Israel had invaded Lebanon and was dropping in kind of indiscriminately bombing areas where there were very many civilians, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of committing war crimes. And that was, I mean, there was an outcry, not just by the reflexive Israel defenders that you would expect to hear from, but even from, members of Human Rights Watch's own board. And the way that we handled it, Peter was on the ground, I think in Lebanon at the time. I was in the New York office where people were absolutely freaking out. Like, how could we accuse Israel of committing war crimes? And the organization handled it with this really impressive transparency. They put the researchers on they organized a call. Any board members who had concerns, or even staff members who had concerns, were able to join the call with researchers on the ground in Lebanon and Israel who were able to document exactly what they found. And everybody was able to ask questions. And we got to a point where we really felt very solid and certain. We had this undeniable evidence that what had happened was a war crime, and we were able to make that allegation credibly backed up by evidence. Even now, but that was one instance. Nonetheless, anytime we criticize Israel of doing anything, it's a major, it's very, very hard, and we have to think about. You don't want to have to think about this stuff, but you do. You have to think about the reputational risk to the organization. Donors withdrawing their donations. What we always try to measure what we can actually achieve. So if we make an allegation, but we have no, even if we're very confident about it, but we don't feel like there's any practical impact that we can make in the world, we might want to think twice about it. And I think that there's a lot of that thinking twice and second guessing around making any kind of allegations against Israel. So that's a particularly perennial, frustrating one, that you've both experienced and that continues today.
Thank you for that. I mean, whilst I'm just looking at the attendees, I know there's some people listening and who have well qualified or may have good questions. And in the back of my mind, forgive me for mentioning names, but there's some good legal minds. Alan Pardo, for example. I don't know if he's happy to ask a question or comment. I know Simon Jackson would have something to say, so I'd love to have Simon's name come up if we can, and possibly Chrissy Fegans, although it is late in Australia. So I'll forgive the Australians for not saying anything. So Peter, can you just follow up on what Stacy was saying? The areas where it's difficult, where it's really politically sensitive, where an organization, it might be Amnesty, it doesn't have to be Human Rights Watch. Some areas are very, very difficult to act on, to talk about.
I think all human rights work is difficult in its own way. It's always very challenging to try to get governments to acknowledge that bad things have happened and to change their behavior. And it is very challenging to get accountability for these crimes. I think it's become a lot more difficult in a world where increasingly a number of world leaders are just flaunting the norms. You have Duterte in the Philippines killing thousands of people involved in drugs or not involved in drugs. We're talking about very poor people who are occasional drug users being gunned down by the police on a daily basis. You have Putin in Russia apparently poisoning one of his main critics just a few days ago. These are all of this has created a climate where it's much more difficult to achieve what we hope to achieve. And obviously the United States, unfortunately, is now very much part of this counteroffensive. And I say, unfortunately, not just for the impact on the human rights movement, but also on the traditional leadership role that the US has built up over decades. You know, the Declaration of Human Rights was signed in San Francisco. It's like, you know, they built up this very important presence, certainly not a perfect performance, but a very important leadership role in the human rights movement. And then they just walked away from it. And they walked away from the international system that they built up.
Yeah.
And the consequences are severe, you know. We only have to look at what happened in Europe in the 1930s with the destabilization of the international system that had been built up, the League of Nations, and the economic crisis that led to the collapse of the German currency, and the consequences of war and absolute devastation that followed. That's why we built up this international system, to prevent the world from descending into the kind of chaos and bloodshed that we saw in the 1940s. So if we dismantle that system, we are taking a great risk of a return to the kind of conflicts we saw during that era.
Yeah. Simon Jackson, can I just bring you in? Because I know you've always got something to raise of interest. So go ahead, Simon, if you can.
Okay. I sort of depressed but not surprised to hear that how difficult it is to raise criticism of Israel. Is it the case, albeit ironically, that for an institution that has such deep roots in America, is it that much easier then to criticize American foreign policy than Israeli?
Peter, I think it's probably fair to ask Peter this, because I know that Stacy's in a tricky position as the current spokeswoman for Human Rights Watch. So Peter, maybe you can deal with that.
You know, I think up to the Trump administration, we always had an open door in most Washington institutions, whether it was a Republican or a Democratic institution. Things got a little bit rocky during the George W. Bush era, maybe. But even then, we had very important allies within the State Department. People like Senator John McCain helped us gain access because he believed in what we were doing in many ways. He often came and visited us out in the field and was always ready for a briefing. So, you know, even on both sides of the political divide, we had important allies. You know, there's been such a dismantling of the State Department that it's become a lot more difficult, and it's become a lot more politicized with the current Secretary of State. So there are some doors certainly which are shut right now. But, you know, I think it's in every government's interest to listen to us, even if you disagree at the end of the day. We bring facts to the table, and they may give you an insight on the ground that you may not have, because in places like Sri Lanka, we go where their diplomats and even their spies don't go. So we do have information that's that's important to their decision-making process.
Yeah.
I can say a little bit also about, I mean, because we don't take any government funding, you know, Human Rights Watch has no problem criticizing the US government and criticizing US foreign policy. The problem comes with, as Peter said, under this administration, I mean, we literally have nobody that we can talk to. The Justice Department is completely politicized. The Justice Department was always a place where we could go and talk to people. Now we can't even go talk to the Justice Department. The State Department, the State Department is a little bit better. There are some remnants that are left that we can speak to, but it too has become very politicized. There are some congressional, you know, we can work with Congress a little bit. The administration itself is a completely closed door, so it's become very difficult and very frustrating in the United States. But it hasn't hindered hasn't hindered us in any way of criticizing US policies at all. It's just a question of effectiveness in doing it. So we can be as outspoken as we want to be, but it's very hard to achieve anything in the US right now.
Wow. Thank you, Stacy. Alan Pardo, I can see you there. Alan, can you, I think your microphone's open. Go ahead, Alan.
Simply this, how do you rate the performance so far of the International Criminal Court? And do you have any changes to propose in the way it performs, in the way it does its work?
So Peter, you've got direct experience of the ICTY. Have you also done work with the International Criminal Court, Peter?
Yes, I've assisted them with their investigations into the crimes being committed in the Central African Republic, and also a bit with their investigations into the situation in Darfur. You know, I think we all had great hopes for the ICC, that it would serve as an important deterrent, partly because of the relatively great achievements of the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal in particular, in bringing some of the biggest criminals of the Balkan War to trial and conviction. I mean, Mladic was just appealing his conviction yesterday for the Srebrenica massacre. But it is an incredible challenge to move from one country, from monitoring the crimes and documenting and prosecuting the crimes in one country, Yugoslavia, to trying to have a global mandate. In my personal experience, the ICC has really struggled to uphold the high quality level of investigations that the Yugoslav Tribunal carried out. Because, you know, they've been mandated to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity in many places with a relatively small budget, yet they've managed to bring very few people to trial, let alone convict them. There's been some convictions overturned as well because of faults of the prosecution. So I think we're still very far from an effective ICC, and the danger now is that with African governments and the US opposing the ICC, that it will be significantly weakened and face great obstacles in achieving what it was set out to achieve.
Well, I'm afraid, chaps, that's our hour is up. My thanks again to Stacy Sullivan and to Peter Boucjkaert. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.